So what I'm going to talk about today is digital ecosystems, and it's kind of that thing of where a product lives in the real world and on your phone and everywhere in between. And because I think it summarizes nicely a lot of things about human beings, like evolving relationship with technology. A lot of, as I think it illustrates nicely, a lot of digital interactions have taken the place of a lot of human interactions, we have like a huge reliance on technology, as you kind of see here, and a seriously emotional connection to it as well, right? Like you can't live without your cell phone or wearable tech or whatever. But from a business standpoint, we as kind of designers and makers and business especially, we have this very sterile approach to digital and to user experience, and we look at KPIs and measurements and quantification and all that kind of stuff. And I think what's interesting is as digital starts to touch more and more of our lives, and we move further and further down this path of connected experiences and the Internet of Things, the contradictions in those two relationships, like true human relationship and the business relationship, really start to come forward. And as you kind of know, like digital experiences and user experience and products, they don't exist in a compartmentalized world anymore. We experience things sequentially or simultaneously or as extensions of one another. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. We spend a lot of time with technology. Like the average person takes their phone out of their pocket and looks at it 1,500 times a week. The average person spends more than 3 hours a day on their phone, and probably in this room we probably spend a little bit more time than that on there. So humbly, I would present to you this hypothesis that as of the 21st century, we've officially entered the era when humanity has become cyborgs. And if you need the definition, that's what it is: a person whose physiological functioning is aided by or dependent upon a mechanical or electronic device. And to use myself as an example for this, when I wake up in the morning, my cell phone is the first thing that I touch because it's my alarm clock. When I go to sleep at night, it's the last thing I touch because I put it down to set my alarm, and then it actually monitors my sleep. It monitors a whole bunch of other stuff, like my diet, how many steps I take, all kinds of different things like that. It controls my schedule. And it's gotten to the point now where I don't even remember my wife's phone number because I've delegated this whole portion of my brain that I used to do manually to an electronic device to take that over for me. With this in mind, though, and like looking at all the ways that people are connected to technology these days, the average person, nearly 70% of people, you only use about 5 apps or fewer on a weekly basis. And if you look at the App Store on the Apple side, not necessarily Google Play, there's 400,000 apps in the App Store that have never been downloaded. That means that 60% of the apps in the App Store have never been downloaded. Which I think brings me to a funny kind of little colloquialism or anecdote. This guy Theodore Sturgeon, he was a science fiction writer in the 50s, and back in the day, people were like, "Oh, well, all science fiction is crap." And his defense was basically like, if you use the same standards to judge film or music or literature or consumer goods, 90% of everything is crap. And I think this holds very true, and it's especially true of digital. But you don't have as direct a connection or as much reliance on literature as you do on digital. And so if we spend so much time with technology, like one of the things that's kind of a burning question in my mind is like, why is there so much crap? And when you start looking at digital ecosystems, like one of the things I've been really kind of curious about is like, one, what makes them successful? Because that's like my job every day. But kind of more importantly, like what makes them fall apart? And that's kind of like my theme for today is like, what makes this digital ecosystem successful and what makes them fail? So I want to start with a little bit of history. I'm kind of a history buff, so I want to I'll start with this and kind of look at the progression of digital, and it hasn't existed for that long. If you look at I would argue that this is kind of the beginning of where personal computing began. This is the Xerox PARC Alto. It came out in 1973, and it was the first computer with a graphic user interface to come out. Of course, 1984. Everybody knows, the original Macintosh, the famous commercial, with the hammer through the screen. And then where I think like the big inflection point was, or like the big place where digital really took off, was around 1995 when Microsoft basically dominated the market. And Windows 95 came out, and it was like this massive point when Everybody had a computer at home. Everybody kind of started to get the internet. AOL took off. The dot-com boom began. I think this is really where the acceleration really started to happen and became part of the mainstream. And then so you start to look at the internet specifically in terms of this digital stuff, and you look at, this was the state of the art in 1996. I remember when I found this website when I was a teenager, and I thought this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. It's got the perfectly seamless background, it's got a circular navigation. I had no idea how they possibly could have done that, and that was the state of the art. And this website's still up, by the way. You can actually go look it up if you want to. You look at 1998 and Google. At the time, this was a big innovation. They just did search better than everybody else, and that was it. Amazon, 1999. The big insight for them was we sell consumer products on the internet, and that was a revolutionary idea. Around 2000, design, I think, started to get involved. Those other few things I've showed you are pretty damn ugly. And this was around 2000, Flash became really popular, and also the beginnings of the bane of our existence of Flash. But this is a site called Soulbath. I think Hi-Res did this, but around the time, you had things like Adaptive Path and other companies really started to take hold. In the mid-2000s, you had the rise of social media. This is the Facebook, 2004, in its infancy. This was only 10 years ago, which is, in the grand scheme of things, not that long. 2005, the most popular phone on the market, the newest, hottest thing in the market in 2005 was the Motorola Razr. And its number one product feature was that it was thin. That was pretty much it. It wasn't like it has better camera or better tech specs or a better OS. It was just thin and fit in your pocket better, which is kind of funny because it's a little bit familiar today. And then, of course, 2007, the iPhone launched and kind of, completely disrupted how digital worked and kind of changed everything and kind of set forth the smartphone revolution. So if you look at this, 20-year period of the internet's rise, you have over here where you actually had to walk around and talk to people, and over here where you don't have to talk to anybody if you don't want to. And what I think is really interesting about this is how there's these big spikes where the whole industry has just leaped forward in a massive way. In 1995, you basically had the big surge in web adoption. Around the late 90s, 98, 99, 2000, you had the dot-com boom and the dot-com bust. Web 2.0 around 2003, 2004, iPhone and the smartphone revolution that happened kind of 2007 and onward. And then something that I don't think a lot of consumers are necessarily very, very familiar with, but the HTML5 CSS3 spec dropped around 2011, 2012, and really, in terms of an industry perspective, completely changed how we have to work. All of our processes had to change, and now the way that we approach the work we do is fundamentally different than what it was before. So if you look at the beginning of this, from the start, back in the day, the medium itself was a novelty. The internet was just the fact that it existed was kind of revolutionary, and the idea of a hyperlink was a novel and innovative idea. The fact that you could link one piece of information to another piece of information to another piece of information, and this was accessible anywhere in the world to anybody who wanted to get it, was an amazing revelation to people. But today, the wave has gotten much, much bigger, and it just continues to grow all the time. Designing for multiple markets and cultures is something that we just are expected to do now. Managing consistency across platforms is a thing that we all have to constantly take note of. And desktop, tablet, mobile, those are table stakes. That's just expected. But what's starting to happen more and more is that we're getting into set-top boxes and consoles and kiosks and wearables and all kinds of other things that all need to be thought about and integrated into these ecosystems. We have participatory experiences. We all know about the second screen, big screen, little screen experience, but more and more we're getting asked to do things where it's a salesperson and a customer, or human-to-human interactions that have where digital comes into play. And data comes from everywhere. It's your interactions. If you go to Netflix or Amazon and you have the things that you click on, the things that you buy, influence your personalization. But digital monitors your physical state, as I mentioned before, and it analyzes the environment around you. Day parting is just a thing. It's expected. The weather, where you are in the world, what your physical environment is, influences the type of content that you see on the internet. And if you look at all the industries that have been revolutionized up to this point, the easy stuff is done. Media, music, movies, travel, all that stuff is kind of easy. It's really easy to outsmart a travel agent with the internet. But if you look at the hard industries, finance, insurance, healthcare, education, automotive, government, those are the things that we're getting briefed for now, to do fundamentally different things with digital to push those industries forward. And I think that's what's really, really interesting about the world today. And if you look kind of back at evolutionary history, I think there's a really great point, that a quote from Darwin here, which kind of encapsulates the whole thing. It's not the smartest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And the pace has been so rapid, in the course of the digital history. We've seen giants rise and fall, and I think a lot of it has been about whether or not they could keep up with innovation. Like where's MySpace today? Doesn't exist. Like what happened to Yahoo? They used to be on top of the world, and now they're kind of like relegated to the B team. And I think like if you kind of look at how the digital history it has evolved, it's kind of interesting to look at how industrial history evolved as well, and kind of to look at the corollaries of, there was an industrial revolution not, 150, 200 years ago. So I want to actually kind of look at that very quickly, if you will allow me the indulgence. So Boomtowns. For those of you who may not know, I'll explain what a boomtown is. A boomtown is a new or existing community that undergoes sudden and rapid growth because of an influx of people. Kind of like the internet. The internet itself is a boomtown, right? Oddly enough, I come from a boomtown. So Seattle, this is Seattle, Washington, 1884, a charming looking place. Wouldn't you love to live there? And this is Seattle today. This is the same view. And you'll notice a very stark difference between these two things. Well, one of them is in black and white, and it looks like a terrible place, and the other one doesn't look so bad. But on the right-hand side of this picture, there's a hill, and on the left-hand side, there's water, and here it's gone. It's because Seattle has seen a bunch of booms throughout its history. In the very early days, it was a timber town, and so a bunch of people moved there for the timber industry. The Yukon Gold Rush happened, so it became an outpost for people on the way to the Yukon. And it's seen an aerospace boom, it's seen a technological boom. But in the early days, the town was built on tide flats. It just happened to be a place. They needed to have a port to ship timber out, and the whole city was on a tide flat that pushed up against this hill. And so the whole city was made of wood. It was all on a bunch of stilts, and it sat on this tide flat where the plumbing would just basically trundle along, down the hill, trundle along across the tide flat and into the Puget Sound, which meant that every day when the tide came in, twice a day, your toilet would erupt inside of your house. A very wonderful place to live. However, their savior, the whole place burnt down. So this was 1864. This is 1884. This is 1889. The whole town burnt down in 12 hours. And so the city founders thought, oh, this is an opportunity. And they're like, how we have that whole sewage problem and this whole tide flat thing and the whole city built on stilts? Let's fix that. So they decided to regrade the entire city and basically blast the hill that the city was backed up against with hydraulic cannons and regrade the city so that the hill basically washed into the sound and they had land to build a real city on top of, which led to some funky things. They did 60 of these, 60 regrades over the course of 50 years to kind of flatten the city out and actually build, make land that was you could actually build stuff on. And if you look today, there's still some artifacts of this boomtown beginning. First of all, Seattle's not exactly in the most logistically appropriate place. It's surrounded on three sides by water. Because of the importance of the railroad, in the early days, there's a railroad there that basically cuts the whole west side of the city off from the rest of it. And it's kind of a weird place to try to get around. Seattle's always been an import-export town. It's a town linking distant outposts, and it's a major gateway to Asia for the United States. And that commerce aspect has always been really important. It's why the timber industry was successful there. It's why the aerospace industry was successful there. And it's also a big reason why technology was successful there as well. And when we talk about the internet as boomtown, I want to talk about one of the biggest boomtowns I think exists. And Amazon is maybe the only mainstay that still carries a lot of weight from the original .com boom. It was founded in 1995, maybe one of the oldest and most successful digital properties out there. But I would actually argue that Amazon's not a digital company. Amazon is actually a shipping company that just happens to have a digital presence. And a lot of the things that you think about today that we talk about as if they're new ideas, Amazon's been doing this stuff forever. They got a lot of things right in the really early days, like A/B testing. They've been doing it forever, and they really focus on quantitative analysis in that way. Amazon's also been doing big data right for a really long time. They got personalization and collaborative filtering right 15 years ago, and they've been harvesting data about people and users for a really long time. The thing I want to talk about, though, most importantly, is small teams. We talk about small teams and lean and all that kind of stuff these days a lot, and Amazon has been doing that for a really long time. And it's actually the first point that I want to make about digital ecosystems and what makes them succeed and fail is team structure. In the early days of Amazon, Jeff Bezos was really, really smart. He had this idea that he was like, his competitive advantage was getting to scale quickly so that no competitor could come and then dominate the space he was in. So they had this idea of 2 pizza teams. And some of you might be familiar with this because it's not necessarily a new concept. But the idea was if your team was too big that you couldn't feed them with 2 pizzas, you need to break your team up into smaller teams. And what I think is really interesting about Amazon is it's a great place to kind of, they've taken a lot of academic principles that we talk about, in small-scale projects all the time, and they've taken those academic theories to their natural terminus and pushed them because Amazon's scale is massive. If you look at the platforms and the products that Amazon has, this is not exhaustive by any means, but like on the left-hand side, you have all the platforms that Amazon has, and there's the website itself, there's the mobile site, there's Kindle, which has 3 different hardware form factors, there's the Fire tablet, which has 5 different hardware form factors. There's Fire Phone, Fire TV, Echo, Amazon Web Services, and like all their development tools that are out there. And then on top of these things, there's like a myriad amount of products that exist on top of it as well. There's 5 different Kindle apps for Android, iOS, Windows Phone, you name it, iPad. There's store apps for shopping for all those platforms as well. Then you've got things that live kind of on the web and across different things in a similar sense. Instant Video, Amazon Music, Cloud Drive, Cloud Reader, Content Manager. There's a ton of these things that are out there. And one level below that is where you actually start to see those 2 pizza teams. And when you look at, this is just for .com, you have a team that's just for search, a team that's just for personalization, a team that's just looking at wish lists, a team that's just looking at tags, a team that just looks at bestsellers. And what I think is really interesting about this is that it makes it so that all those teams move very nimbly and act very independently, but you end up with some interesting managerial or governance problems that kind of surface when you look at things that maybe aren't so important to Amazon's future. This is a product which I actually really like. I think is pretty fantastic. It's called Listmania. Probably no one here even knows that this exists, but it's a great idea. And a third party could do this amazingly well, but it's not a profit driver for Amazon, so they don't pay a lot of attention to it. The idea is, pretty simple. You make lists of things you love, and then you can share on the web. People can look at it, and you can basically, be an influencer in that way. The thing is, this product was built a long time ago. It ingests a bunch of feeds from a bunch of different places, and no team maintains it as a product anymore. And if you look at like the left navigation up there, like the left navigation at Amazon hasn't looked like that for maybe 10, maybe 15 years. And this is just basically Amazon's own ecosystem, right? Like this is its own digital ecosystem of its own internal teams working on its own internal platform and its own internal vertical products. What's more interesting to me is like what happens when you look at Amazon's ecosystem when it starts to run into other complex ecosystems. In this example, it's Apple. This page here is the product detail page for a Kindle book on the Amazon iPhone app. And you'll notice one glaring problem with this page that isn't readily apparent when you first look at it, and it's this. This application does not support purchasing digital content. However, you may add the item to your wish list and purchase it at Amazon.com on your mobile device or computer. But I'm on my phone, and I want to read this on my phone, and this is the app. Why doesn't this work? This problem isn't actually, this isn't actually Amazon's fault. I mean, it sort of is, but it's not. The way that applications in the App Store work is Microsoft takes 30% from any sale of a digital product from an app in the App Store. So of course Amazon's not going to let that happen. So they just don't sell digital content through their application. And this is a major flaw in this digital product. But since there is not an easy way to move nimbly and correct this problem, it just kind of lingers and languishes on. So there's this quote. This is Larry Tesler. He used to run user experience at Amazon. He's the guy who invented copy paste. In case you're ever wondering, he was my boss at one point. And so the point here is that Amazon's a very complex system, and small teams tend to lose the forest for the trees in terms of like looking at like the broader picture of things. And I think Larry puts this very well. Every application has an inherent amount of complexity that cannot be removed or hidden. Instead, it must be dealt with either in product development or in user interaction. I think that's what you see a lot across a lot of digital ecosystems. It's just the simple thing of it's too hard for a large organization to reconcile a bunch of the complexities of their ecosystem, so it ends up getting thrust onto the user. And I have a couple of more examples of that that I'll get onto in just a second. Corporate underpants. I didn't make this term up. Corporate underpants, the idea here is, I heard this probably 10 years ago for the first time. When you show your corporate underpants, it basically is when your org chart becomes the navigation for your website. And as the digital industry has gotten more and more complex, the corporate underpants problem has just been magnified. So what I'm talking about here is business structure. Like at one level you have team structure, and above that you have business structure. So as we're looking at a digital ecosystem in terms of like the Amazon.com website, what happens when you look at the broader picture of like all the other things that it touches on? And one of the big briefs that we get at Huge all the time now is, hey, build us an Apple Watch app. And so it's the hot thing. We want to be out there. We want to be out in front of it. We want to be innovative and do something with Apple Watch, And sure, if you're Calendar or Shazam or Nike or Twitter or Maps or Swarm, Foursquare, whatever, Yelp, it probably makes a ton of sense for you to have an Apple Watch app. If you're Abercrombie and Fitch, I don't know. American Eagle Outfitters, Safeway, I don't know. The thing that people don't think about in these when they're like this new shiny ball, new hotness thing is like, what about the old stuff? What about the stuff that we see every day? Like self-checkout at the grocery store. This is a picture of Tesco, but you wouldn't know it. And the reason why is because every single one of these self-checkout things look exactly the same no matter what store you go into. And so if you go to like Tesco or Waitrose or Sainsbury's or Safeway or Albertsons or whatever the supermarket that you go to may be, they spend tons of money on brand experiences every year. In whatever currency you want, they spend a ton of money differentiating themselves, like positioning themselves differently than the competition. And then when you're in your little digital bubble and you walk into the store and you don't want to talk to anybody, the one interaction you actually have with the store is right here. And it's exactly the same for every single store, no matter where you go. The interface is the same, the form factor is the same, and it all sucks. It's terrible. And it's because this is the ugly stuff that people actually use and actually makes people's lives better, but no one really pays attention to because it's too complicated or it's too cumbersome to take advantage of. Airlines are the worst at this. So, just like Amazon is a shipping company, airlines, if Amazon is in the business of shipping products, airlines are in the business of shipping people. They're not digital entities. And that exposes itself really, really badly because they inherently have the largest number of disparate systems out there. So, I flew here yesterday and I experienced this firsthand. You go to a website, I'm picking on United specifically, but this is pretty much applicable to any airline you go to. You buy a ticket on the website, and then the day of your flight, you go to the mobile app, and it's a totally different experience. All the digital back-end stuff doesn't really sync up correctly, so at some point you get kicked over to the mobile app. The mobile app is a completely different experience as well. And then you go to the airport, and you go to the kiosk. And the kiosk, again, completely different thing. Like the form factor is different, the look and feel is different, the UI interaction patterns are all different. And then when you get on the plane and sit there and look at the screen in the back of the seat for hours on end, that's a completely different experience as well. And none of these things sync up. And the reason why is because all of these things are owned by different teams. The website might be owned by the marketing team. The kiosk at the airport might be owned by the physical, build-out architecture team. And the screen in the back of the seat is owned by the aircraft, whatever manufacturing team. I'm making up the names of these teams, but you see what I mean. And so there's this guy, Melvin Conway. I thought I'd come up with this idea like a long time ago. I was like, oh, your org chart's ruining your website. Turns out this guy came up with this in 1968, so I was way behind on this one. But he said, any organization that designs systems will inevitably produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. I think this is really interesting because the way that a business communicates with itself is very efficient for the business, and those natural sort of tensions between product verticals tend to pay off for business. The problem is when you expose those things through a digital or other type of interaction, it doesn't work for human beings. As a human, when I traverse that system, I feel all those gaps between those product verticals where this is where profit runs into people. So now I'm going to get really wonky on you and talk about local maxima and tragedy of the commons. I'll unpack this a little bit more because it's kind of this is, hello. But really what we're talking about here is quantitative analysis. And so, this is another thing. Measurement and KPIs are a thing that we always go back to constantly in digital. And so I want to talk about that for a second. So local maxima. Local maxima is the natural outcome of A/B testing. So local maxima is you have a thing on a page and you want to test it and say control versus variant, control versus variant, control versus variant, and you can keep optimizing and keep optimizing and keep optimizing to a point where you can optimize no further with the current system. The problem with that is that it never shows you, that only shows you what you've done in the past. It doesn't show you what you could do if you tried something completely different. So you have your local maximum and then potentially a better design that you have no idea even exists because you've been too busy, lost in the minutia of what actually makes the current solution work so well. Tragedy of the commons is a term that's borrowed from sheep herders, basically, or any kind of grazing animal. If you go to the south of England, down near Seven Sisters, there's all these massive green fields with sheep in them, and that's the commons. It's basically a place that any local sheep herder can bring their sheep to graze, and it's this common area that everybody uses. And if you're a entrepreneurial, business-oriented sheep herder, it's in your best interest to have your sheep eat as much grass as possible because it means your herd is more healthy. It means that you're more profitable and you become the most successful sheep herder that there is. The problem is that if everybody did that, the whole field, the commons would all die and everybody's flock would fail. And that's basically what tragedy of the commons means. So I'll pick on Amazon a little bit more here, but this is just a very, very simple example. If you look at this is a product carousel on the website. You see these kind of everywhere. Netflix uses them, whatever. But on Amazon, you'll see many, many different versions of this depending on where you go on the site. And I took these screenshots not at different times or anything like that, years apart, days apart. I took these all on the same day, just in different parts of the site. And the thing about the way Amazon works is that they A/B test everything. And they have these two pizza teams A/B testing with the thing that they're working on all the time. So every single one of these teams that has a different instance of this product carousel has data that proves that solution worked and it's the best solution for them. The problem is, they see it in isolation. As a user, you traverse across it and it just looks sloppy. And over time, this starts to wear away at the brand, right? You have this problem where you start to the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and you start to think how disorganized is this? Do I trust this? With Amazon, I don't think they have that problem, but for smaller brands, they definitely do. And so there's this guy, Russell Acuff. This guy's a genius. He's an American organizational theorist. He's a consultant, professor, Wharton School of Business, luminary dude. And he put this better than anybody else. If we have a system of improvement that's directed at improving the parts taken separately, you can be absolutely sure that the performance of the whole will not be improved. I think this is really interesting because continuous improvement isn't nearly as important as discontinuous improvement. Creativity is discontinuity. A creative act breaks with the chain that came before it. You never become a leader by imitating the leader and then improving slightly. You become a leader by leapfrogging the people who are in front of you. And I think that is one of the things that as we have this mentality in digital of build, test, learn. Build, test, learn works really, really well up to a point. At that point, you have to take all the knowledge that you've accumulated and use that knowledge to have an actual vision of where you need to go. If all you do is drive your car while looking in the rearview mirror, you're inevitably going to drive off a cliff at some point because you got to know when to turn. Speaking of turning, big ship, little rudder. This is the last example that I'll run through. And the idea here is, you've probably heard this in terms of corporations, it's a big corporation, we're a big ship with a little rudder. But what I like to think of this is qualitative analysis. Being in touch with your users, and say what you want about Bill Gates, but this guy got it. Bill Gates is the man. He was a total genius. He understood network effect better than anybody else in history, probably. And his mission statement for Microsoft in the early days was very, very simple: a computer on every desk and in every home. That's easy for anybody to understand. And I'll go back to that whole inflection point thing from the very beginning of the presentation, Windows 95. And when this thing took off, they dominated the market. And like Apple wasn't even in the conversation, not even playing in the same league. Microsoft was the monopoly. They had everything. And with Windows came Internet Explorer. And Internet Explorer was central to the monopoly. Without Windows was inextricable from IE. IE was the Finder, and it was the internet browser, and Microsoft Office came along with it, and it was all this like perfect package, and it was a beautiful ecosystem of stuff that all worked together. And it was a brilliant strategical maneuver. The problem is like that ecosystem inevitably gets bigger and bigger and bigger and harder to manage from a high level. And so the same thing that was central to Microsoft's success, I believe, was also central to their decline. And that was, as everybody probably here has lamented, like, when will IE6 die? And the thing was, like in the early days, like you have Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows 2000, Windows ME, which I think they'd like to forget about, and then you had Windows XP. And then, like every 2 years, a new version of Windows came out, a new version of Internet Explorer came out, and everything was all fine and good until they hit Windows XP. Between Windows XP and Windows Vista was a 6-year gap, which meant that Internet Explorer didn't really get updated in that period of time either. And since it was built into the operating system, and the operating system was in every corporation and every government, in North America and probably the world, it meant that like you couldn't force an update without breaking everybody's stuff. And so since they hadn't disconnected the OS from the browser, it meant that they couldn't update the browser without updating the operating system. And between 2001 and 2007, web standards became a really big issue, and it became something that people were really paying attention to. So if you look at the history of browsers, Internet Explorer, in the nearly 20 years that it's existed, it's only been updated 11 times. If you look at Chrome, it's only existed for about 7 years, and it's been updated 42 times. I think this is kind of one of the things about making things highly compatible, but easy to take apart. So this was 2013. This was the new mission statement for Microsoft in the Ballmer era. A family of devices and services for individuals and businesses that empower people around the globe at home, at work, and on the go for the activities they value most. Can't you just imagine the group of white guys sitting around a boardroom table coming up with this? Like, I think we need to mention global. I don't think people are going to know. Did we mention people's values? We want to know that we're a values company. And I guarantee you that any person in this room can recite to me what the Bill Gates mission statement was. Can you recite what that one was to me now? No. I think that there's this guy, Dan Hahn, who has a great kind of encapsulation of what this is, and he calls it the empathy gap. And it's that distance between an organization and its audience, such that at worst, it's clear that the organization is willfully ignoring how its audience might feel. And I think this is a really salient point, because Microsoft, their whole thing was like business efficiency and economies of scale and really leveraging the network effect and all these things that users don't give a shit about. All people want to be is considered, and I think that's kind of one of the things that Microsoft kind of missed in their quest for global dominance was at the end of the day, your product is in the hands of real people. So I'll get to building an ecosystem. It's easy to knock things that aren't that great. So let's talk about how to make things that are great. And I'll go back to where I started, which is the real-world example of the Industrial Revolution and the Seattle kind of bad planning in the beginning and massive refactoring that had to happen. And look at New York City. This is Manhattan. Between 1821 and 1855, New York City nearly quadrupled in population. But this didn't come as a surprise to them. First of all, New York was in a much better location to begin with than Seattle was. But they knew that the population was going to blow up in 1811. And so what you're looking at here is the commissioner's plan for the city. And if you look at the left side of the graphic, you can kind of see where Manhattan organically evolved up until about 14th Street. And that was the point when the city commissioner was like, we need to step in and put in a plan so that as the city scales, it scales rationally and that we actually have an organized way of making this happen. And many people, this is the actual document that was drafted, and many people say that this is the single most important document in the history of New York City. But what I think is great about this is that there's another example. This guy, Robert Moses. So it's not just about setting up the plan in the first place, but adjusting the plan as you move forward. And Robert Moses is a really, really polarizing character in the history of New York City. He's loved by many, despised by probably more. And I think this quote kind of really summarizes why. He was the master builder for New York City for about 50 years. A lot of the parks, highways, parkways, and the famous buildings that you see in New York City are a result of this guy's work. But he had a very, iron-fisted, drive-forward kind of way of doing business. And, he has this quote: "If you can draw any kind of picture you want on a clean slate and indulge your every whim in the wilderness, laying out New Delhi, Canberra, or Brasilia, all planned cities. But when you operate in an overbuilt metropolis, you have to hack your way with a meat axe." And that's why people hate him. So I think this is really interesting, though, because he wasn't precious about the things that already existed. New York was laid out on a great foundation, but as the thing grew and evolved, he had the understanding that you had to have a vision and you had to basically break some eggs to make an omelet, if you will. And so, to go back to Microsoft, I used to work at Microsoft back in the day, and I sat in a meeting one time, and I was probably 22, 23 years old, just kind of assumed that all these old dudes that wore suits knew what they were talking about. And I sat in a meeting one time, and a guy said, I don't remember who it was, but a guy said this: "If you're in the future, you'll have a server in your basement and thin clients throughout your house, serving as your TV, your phone, everything." Great prediction, right? That's exactly how the world works today. Yeah, Steve Jobs. Everybody talks about Apple. Whenever if you walk into 3 client meetings at Huge, in 2 of them, someone will be like, "Oh, we want to be like Apple. We love Apple." But I don't think people really understand why Apple is great. It's yeah, Johnny Ive is a genius, and they make beautiful products. But I think what makes Apple truly successful is their understanding of ecosystem and the way that the Apple ecosystem works. If you look at this is kind of a snapshot of the Apple product catalog. If you buy any one of these products, they pretty much work on their own, and it's a wonderful experience. You buy an iPad, it's a great media consumption device. You buy a MacBook, it's a great laptop. What makes Apple amazing is that when you buy 2 of their products, the pairing makes both of them better. So if you buy, an Airport Extreme and an iPad, they work together. If you buy an iPad and the keyboard together, they work together. If you put all 3 of them together, you now have a music streaming service, and you can stream music from one room in your house to the other. And as you buy more and more Apple products, the ecosystem gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and it traps you into their walled garden more and more and more. And I think what's great about it is you can upgrade each of those elements individually without ruining the entire thing, because the whole thing just works. Every time you turn one thing on, the other thing just works. And the reason I think that exists behind this is right here. This is the first thing that you see whenever you open any Apple product. The first word you see when you open any Apple product is design. And design is the human element in the woodwork of digital. And I think this is such a great thing that Apple does. Anytime you open an Apple product, the first phrase that you see inside of it is designed by Apple in California. You know there's human beings behind that looking out for human experiences. And so if I have one point that I want you all to take home from this, is that when you're designing digital products or designing products that will fit into a digital ecosystem, design with empathy and build for scale. This is kind of it, right? If you can boil the whole thing down into one phrase, design with empathy and build for scale. The caveat of that is no excuses. So that's all well and good in theory, but the thing is, I walk into a lot of conversations, and people are like, "Oh, we have a legacy platform," or "Oh, we have political agendas that are at odds with each other," or "Oh, there's budget limitations," or "The logistics of it just don't work." And guess what? Users don't give a fuck about your logistics. All they care about is being considered. That's the only thing that they care about. They care about the task in front of them and whether or not you're going to help them get it done. And so when you go to the airport and everybody's angry, and then the digital ecosystem doesn't help that, you're not being empathetic to what your users actually need at the time. Humans just want to be considered, so be considerate. So if there's 5 things that kind of go into building a digital ecosystem, I think that there are these. Number 1, humanize your mission. A computer on every desktop and in every home. It's very simple. Just simplify the message so that anybody can understand it. And base it on real human beings. Boil these things down to first principles and go forward from there. Number 2 is give each product a purpose. If you have a mobile website and an app, why do all of these things exist? Is it just this? Is it same across? What's the point? What's the purpose of each of your platforms, and how do those things complement each other? If you think about the iPod and the laptop, those 2 things complement each other. They're not the same. They're not the same product in 2 different form factors. Number 3 is create lateral efficiency. I think there's two elements to this that are flip sides of the same coin. Number 1 is development. So creating lateral efficiencies in infrastructure, data quality, modularity, accessibility of information. And then on the design side, it's about reuse. Like, how does this work in the context of that? Like, how does one thing complement another, and how do those things make each other stronger when you move laterally across them? The fourth is very closely tied to number 3, but I think there's a slight nuance to it, which is design for extensibility. As you saw in the example of Seattle, brittle design systems lead to really expensive refactoring. So, if your problem is this big today, like you should, and that's all you're designing for, you should still think about what happens when the problem is this big tomorrow. And have you made this problem extensible enough, and have you left your design open-ended enough so that you can actually plug more things into it without having to tear everything out and start over from scratch? And then the last one, fix or nix. This is basically the idea of, like, why does Amazon still have list mania? Like, it has the potential to be a great product, so either invest in it or kill it. And Apple is really good at this. Like, if you think about the optical drive, everybody freaked out when they took the optical drive away. Did you end up really needing it? I would argue you didn't. When they upgraded from OS 9 to OS 10, it was a really painful thing, and they were like, tough, deal with it. We're going to OS 10, it's going to be better. You're going to have to upgrade all your apps. A bunch of developers are going to have to do a bunch of work, but it's what's best for the ecosystem, and it's what's best for the future, and so they just did it. And they had the balls to actually go out there and just make big bets and make bold moves because they knew that it was the right thing to do. They didn't necessarily have quantitative analysis backing it up, but because of their experience and the things that they knew that it was the right thing to do. So if you look at kind of the way that I think Huge looks at digital ecosystems, it kind of boils down to something like this. At the center, you have the company. This is the organization, your people, the processes, and around that, in the digital sphere, you have your core digital brand assets. This is the stuff that you own. It's your websites, your apps, it's mobile sites, email, PR, that kind of thing. Things that you directly own and you directly control. From there, you have things that you indirectly control, or participatory experiences. And this is the inbound marketing ring. So this tends to be things that it's like a push-pull kind of relationship. You have social media, like how do you show up on Facebook? How do you show up on Twitter? How do you show up in the social realm? And as well, like how do you show up on other platforms such as like search and local search, GPS, app discovery? Like what's your presence in the App Store? What happens when you Google the thing that you're looking for? What happens when you Google a keyword that's relevant to your business? Like, and how can you influence like this sphere where it's an indirectly controlled but still highly relevant to your business? And then the last ring is media and advertising, and this is the above the line traditional stuff that we've all kind of lived with forever: commercials, radio, billboards, magazines, print advertising, that kind of thing. And the whole point of this is like what you're looking at is effectively the top of a funnel, right? And so like if you look at as people start to interact with your stuff, they might see your ad on television, they might like run into a post about your company or your product on Facebook or on Twitter, and then they might interact with your one of your digital products, firsthand. And I think the whole point of this is as that, if that whole experience is seamless, and that whole experience is each of those touch points is complementary of one another, it basically prevents people exiting from the customer journey, and it ingratiates people to your brand, and it builds the brand over time just because you've gone to the trouble of making everything cohesive and the whole product work as a coherent whole. To give you an example of this, I'll show you some work that we've done at Huge in the past. Huge, if you guys aren't familiar, Lowe's Home Improvement is the number 2 home improvement brand in the United States. They're a direct competitor to Home Depot. And Huge is the digital agency of record for them. And one of the first projects we worked on with them was their kind of mobile experience. And it struck me as odd when I first started working on the project. Why is a hardware store investing so heavily in mobile? But it's really smart if you think about it, because if you're a contractor on a job site, you're probably not even going to have electricity, let alone an internet connection. So mobile's a really smart place to play. And so we have done, their iOS app, their Android app, their mobile website, their iPad app, all that kind of stuff. But I think what was really cool, and what was my kind of most intriguing opportunity, was we also did the employee app. And at the time, Lowe's was Apple's biggest enterprise customer. They bought something like 50,000 iPhones and gave them out to all of their staff. And it's the app that the whole staff carries around in the store. It's how they do shipping and receiving. It's how they do inventory management, all that kind of stuff. But the big secret in the background is that before we ever showed up to do any work, Lowe's did a lot of legwork to do that whole lateral efficiency thing on the back end side, the ugly stuff that nobody thinks about, that transactional point of sale kind of stuff. And so when you do a search on the web for a product, it can show you where your local store is. It can show you whether or not that product is available at that local store. It'll tell you what aisle the product is on. It'll tell you what exactly what point in the aisle that product's available in. And basically all the product information around it. And the reason that they're able to do this is because they've basically normalized all the data between all of their different systems everywhere. And they have all their store floor plans online. And when you go into the store and you scan an item, the app has a barcode reader in it. You scan an item, you can get all the product information about it. You can get recommendations of complementary products. You can get recommendations of, perhaps better products. And they've done a lot of work to get their ratings and reviews quality up, so that they're actually giving you helpful reviews and not just being, pumping their own products because they know that there's trust in bad reviews. And so I think what's really interesting about this is that all their data is normalized in the middle. And when you walk in and you start to talk to an employee can very easily on their app look up who you are. If you're a known customer, they can scan your MyLowe's card, wherever, look up your information. They can push information to you into your app, like if you walk in with a picture of a problem that you have. They can push you information. They can push you products. They can push you original content that Lowe's has invested in to help you solve the problem that you have. And it also means that they have a ton of data on all their customers that they can then start to leverage to tailor experiences to their customers better. And if you look at the way that this ecosystem kind of works, at the top here you kind of see all those sort of outbound experiences. It's like the mobile app, the desktop website, maybe like stuff you see on television, digital signage, that sort of thing. Things that you experience in the real world. Below that, you kind of have the user and all the things that they experience in the social realm, like Twitter or Facebook and all that kind of stuff. And Lowe's knows that when you walk into the store, you bring all that with you. It's knowledge and it's the digital apps and all that kind of stuff. But what's great is that they have this complementary aspect to it as well that strengthens the entire ecosystem. And when you get in, you have a mobilized team, you have interactive signage, you have exclusive offers, and smart mobile apps that are location aware, know where you are in the store. And I think the whole point of this is that seamless experience is a competitive advantage. No one is doing this well right now, save for Apple. I think Google's getting there, but everybody else is really falling down on this. And this is kind of, I think, the next thing in the next leap forward. There's a lot of hard problems to do, but until people start to get this right, we'll never go anywhere. Seamless experience, competitive advantage. That's it. Thanks.